So thanks everyone. As Eitan says, I'm just the lawyer, unfortunately, Marta couldn't be here tonight. But actually, that's nonsense. No, Marta is not here because she just doesn't like you. She doesn't like many people at all. But that's good. Honestly, that's good because when Marta likes somebody, bad things happen to them. So you're probably safe when she doesn't like you. I'm really safe because she fucking hates me. But it would be remiss of her not to thank a few people in this room, starting with the Hospital Writing Salon, who, going back, 14 years ago, when Marta was 6, they brought this book, they helped bring this book into existence. It's a very painful birth, and they've shepherded it through. So thank you to Ben and to Mark and to Eitan and to, I think that's everyone from the Writing Salon, but thanks for that support that you gave. And then Eitan in particular, Eitan's had this unwavering faith in the book all through these years and helped bring it about. And then more recently, the Datora gang, and it's sad that Eleanor couldn't be here, and Dan, who edited the books, but and the rest of the team have done a fantastic job. So thank you very much. Now, Eitan asked me to say a few words about weird subjects. So it's about Satanism and the worlds of sort of heavy metal and black metal and popular culture more broadly. So my challenge is to do that in under 10 minutes and without being boring, and I suspect that I'll fail in both respects, but I'll give it up. But here we go. So, Satan, been around for a while. So he features in this book, which is quite a bit older than this book. This book has got 2 parts: the original Jewish version and then the Christian sequel. And Satan appears in both. But Satan has there's a credible argument that Satan predates the Old Testament by many years, in the sense that virtually every Abrahamic religion had a concept of a negative energy, a negative force, a negative deity to balance out the all-powerful God, and it was the Old Testament that gave it the name Satan and actually gave him a nice little backstory. But he's always been there. But the Satan in the Bible, and this is my take. All of this is my take. The Satan in the Bible is not somebody to worship. He's not somebody that anybody praises. He's a negative energy. He's sort of a counterpoint to God and to Christ in the New Testament. You have to sort of go forward, I think, sometime before you find somebody who is. You find people who are actually sort of worshipping Satan. I'm going to jump forward. I'm sure there's people who will tell me that there's points in between. I'm going to jump forward to the 13th century. So this book, Marta's book, the band in this book is called Baphomet's Agony. And Baphomet is a goat-headed god that in the 13th century the Knights Templar were accused of worshipping as a surrogate for Satan. Whether or not they did, we don't know. It could have been just a bit of propaganda, anti-Templar propaganda, but it's an interesting point, because that point in the 13th century you get an instance of the concept of Satan being worshipped, and also the Satan being the concept of Satan worshipping entering the public consciousness. But I'm going to skip all the way forward now to the 1930s, because by the 1930s you've got printing presses and you've got the advent of cinema, and then Satanism seems to have a moment, and in fiction, with stories like this, Dennis Wheatley's Devil Rides Out, which is a fantastic book. Piece of fiction, you've got a very charismatic leader in this story who wages a sort of a war against clandestine Satanists who intent on ruining the world and sacrificing virgins and children in the process. What's interesting about this kind of Satanism, which actually this concept of Satanism has pervaded right the way through to today, where you've got ideas, currently you've got conspiracy theories in the States about significant Democrat figures having satanic rituals in pizza restaurants, but that's very much this kind of Satanism. This kind of Satanists as evil people doing evil things and sacrificing children, but also generating supernatural powers from doing that. Now, I think this is pretty much a fictitious idea. I'm not sure. I mean, there would have been people there would have been covens and witches, but the idea of people actually sacrificing children and generating enormous bits of power out of it, I think is a fictitious idea, but it was a powerful one, and it got currency. And from the 30s onwards, you had that in books and you had that in cinema, and it was powerful. But at the same time, a different kind of Satanism, more attached to the occult, came into the 20th century. You had this fella. You can't see who this is, but this is Aleister Crowley, who is probably the most significant occultist in hundreds of years. A fascinating individual with a strong story connected to Watkins' books. I mean, there's a lot of stories about Crowley in Watkins, including one story where he made the entire contents of the bookshop disappear. That's in one of the biographies. But what he did, he was a fascinating character. He was born in the 19th century into a Plymouth Brethren family, but he immersed himself in all religion. He was a polymath, chess player, somewhat unlike Eitan, but actually in many respects completely unlike Eitan. But interesting character, narcissist, nutcase, hedonist. But what he did a couple of things which were very interesting. First, he was a voracious consumer of everything, including drugs and sex, but also books, and particularly books about esoteric religion. And he just subsumed all of this into himself, and then sort of synthesized it into his own sort of spirituality, which he then condensed down into this little book. Famously, the famous line from this book is "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." That's his principle. But the other thing he did was he celebrated the occult. So with Crowley and people like him, he said, look, this is nothing to be afraid of. This is something to be celebrated. This is something considered and sophisticated, intellectual and spiritual. So he sort of moved the discussion along. So it was not about evil for evil's sake. It was more nuanced than that. But he also loved the notoriety that came. I mean, he was very happy being described as a Satanist. The newspapers of the day described him as the most evil man in the world, and he loved that. He described himself as the Beast 666. So he revelled in this idea that he was a devil-worshipping lunatic. And he was certainly a lunatic, but I'm not sure he was really a devil worshipper. But he was happy with that. So that was the. I mean, he died in 1947. But these ideas then sort of percolated for a while, and then, again, this is my view. I'm sure other people have different views on this, but they seemed to get currency in the 60s with the countercultural movement. They were sort of absorbed into the hippies, and everyone sort of started thinking, because he used copious amounts of drugs, and he was an advocate of free love. And he was into sort of Eastern mysticism, and all of these things were swirling around in counterculture as well. So he became a bit of a countercultural icon, and these ideas started sort of almost entering the mainstream. And then there was another important book from that period is this one, the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey is another character who's a sort of larger-than-life character. Picture him in the back there. I mean, he looks like the archetypal Satanist, doesn't he? Bald head, goatee beard. He looks like Ming the Merciless from the Flash Gordon film. And look, this book has got that's Baphomet again. So Baphomet within a pentagram appears on that. My take on this book, my personal take on this book, is that LaVey doesn't really believe in Satan. He doesn't believe in God. What he believes in, though, he takes Satan as a metaphor for a sort of an internal deity. So he says, don't look externally for your gods, look inside for your gods, find your gods inside you. And he calls that Satanism. And he called himself a Satanist. He started the Church of Satan, which to this day remains a registered charity in America, and with a huge following. And he created this book, which the Satanic Bible, which is I'm sure is in here somewhere. There'll be multiple copies of it in here. It's a very influential book. So this again was the 60s, and by this point, these ideas of Satanism and the occult were really taking hold in the counterculture, to the extent that Aleister Crowley appears on Sgt. Pepper. Up here in the corner is Aleister Crowley as in this sort of pantheon of significant cultural figures of the age. And the Beatles, because the Beatles were into all this sort of stuff as well, drugs, sex, Eastern mysticism. So they absorbed all these ideas, as did a lot of the bands. So now we're finally talking about music, because the bands of the day in the 60s started embracing this sort of more sophisticated occultism, and didn't mind the idea of Satan, but Satan is a metaphor. Satan as a sort of mystic figure, and this is one of my favourite albums from the era. This is the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, which was a big success in its time. In its day, it was a critical and commercial success. But the band King Crimson, I mean, the Red King, that was clearly a reference to Satan there, and so they were sort of hiding in plain sight, people with an affiliation to Satan. So bands like this absorbed these ideas, and famously, Led Zeppelin and Jimmy Page, who was and remains a big fan of Crowley and has a huge collection of Crowley memorabilia, and actually at one point owned his Scottish lodge. These ideas were influencing the music, were appearing in the music, were appearing in the lyrics of the music. But I think this is a sort of a mystical, intellectualized version of Satanism, which was going hold in the 60s, which was a sort of a more positive era. That changed in the 70s. It got a bit darker in the 70s, and I think it got a bit dumber in the 70s, because I love Black Sabbath. But Black Sabbath's take on Satanism is kind of dumb, because it actually owes more to Dennis Wheatley than it does to Aleister Crowley, Black Sabbath, because what they did was, is this the end, my friend? Satan's come around the bend. The lyrics. So this is going back to the idea of Satan being this terrifying evil force that's going to kill you and corrupt you. But at the same time, it was powerful, and even though pretty sure Ozzy Osbourne doesn't believe in Satan, he was quite happy to wear the clothes, wear the inverted crucifixes, and accept that that parents in particular were describing him as a Satanist. But they just sort of absorbed the sort of the aesthetics. But the message they were telling was Satan is bad, kids, keep away. And then heavy metal sort of took that and ran with it through the 70s, until you got to the 80s. And in the 80s, there was a sort of subtle change, I think. Maybe it happened in the late 70s, but in the 80s, you had bands like Venom from Newcastle, this album is called Black Metal from 1982. It's not actually a black metal album, it's a heavy metal album, but it's quite influential. It was the first time black metal was mentioned. And what bands like Venom did was unlike the difference between this and Black Sabbath is that bands like Venom said, no, Satan is good. Satan isn't something to be afraid of. We are Satanists. But it was quite tongue-in-cheek. It was quite... I got the sense that, again, they were just playing a game. It was a bit of a pantomime. But the difference between the pantomime they were playing and the Black Sabbath pantomime was that they were saying, no, we are Satanists, and we're writing songs about how great Satan is. By the late 80s, it started to get really, really dark and weird, and it moved to Scandinavia. In particular, it moved to Norway. And by the time it got there, this was about as extreme as it got, when you had bands like Dark Throne and Mayhem, who took these ideas. And this band in particular, I want you to read Confessions of an Antichrist, and you'll read it and you'll think this stuff is outlandish and how could this ever happen, and isn't it funny because it's a work of fiction. But actually what happened with this band is more outrageous than anything that happens in that book. This band, during a period of about 18 months, a 4-piece band, the singer blew his head off, and then his own head off, and then the bassist murdered the guitarist. And this was a band that was having mainstream success at the time.
Sorry, what's the name of the band?
Mayhem. And so put that on your playlist.
Must.
The difference between these guys and bands like Venom was that these guys weren't playing. These guys were super serious about being evil. They were murdering. They were burning down churches. They were living the life that the other bands had sung about. They were living the life that Black Sabbath had warned us about, and that Venom were pretending to live. But these guys were actually living it. But if you ask me if these guys had a sort of a spiritual, theological justification of what they're doing, I don't think they did. I think that they were young and dumb, and they were probably quite damaged. They were making interesting music. I mean, black metal music, this kind of black metal music, really low production values, deliberately difficult to listen to, full of anger, but strangely has a strange kind of, well, I think it's got a strange draw to it. But I don't think that they were looking for something to justify their craziness, so they called themselves Satanists. But I don't think they ever had a sort of a philosophy behind them. But what was interesting, I think, is that at the same time that was happening, and after that was happening, there was another sort of a movement, again in Scandinavia, that was, and this is a band called Bathory, who took sort of Norse mythology and actually made the same kind of music, but rather than call themselves Satanists, they called themselves pagans, and they did actually have a sort of a theology behind them, because they said that they subscribed to these pagan gods, Odin, and they sang songs about Ragnarok and Valhalla, and they had a sort of a pagan theology behind them, and actually that's endured. So there are bands out there still. They're not in the mainstream, but there are bands who sort of espouse these kind of ideas of the really extreme black metal guys. But there's a lot more, I think, of the sort of the Norse bands, the pagan bands, who have run with it. You've got to ask, though, when bands like this were burning down churches and killing themselves, where does it go from here? Where does satanic heavy metal, black metal go? And I think the answer is it never really got more extreme than this. These guys were the high watermark of insane, depraved, satanic music. Nowadays, well, you can still find bands doing these sort of low production value, garage sort of punk, sort of heavy metal, and calling it black metal with the guttural vocals. But black metal sort of took a strange turn and went back and went back. And you've got bands now like this is Dimmu Borgir and Cradle of Filth, who are another British band. They're from Suffolk this time. They call themselves black metal, but they're nothing like these bands. They growl, but they don't. But the production values on these albums are insane. I mean, they've got lush orchestration, synthesizers, women singing on them. So it's a completely different. And you just have to look at the cover art to see that this is a completely different kind of aesthetic to the ones of the early, the first wave of black metal. But looking at it from a distance, what it seems to me is you've got these sort of cycles. You've got if you start with Dennis Wheatley, who was kind of dumb and scary, and then you get the sort of the more considered, sophisticated sort of Crowley leading into the Beatles. Then it goes back to the dumb with Black Sabbath. Then the Norwegians take it off into a really weird place. And now it's kind of gone back. And these bands, again, they're sort of singing like Venom was singing about satanic things, but you get the impression they're not really Satan worshippers. They're just putting on that. It's another pantomime. It's just another evolution of the pantomime, which is interesting because it does seem that that's the cycle. I think you can look at the Norwegians who just went off in a sort of a spur and went nuts. But otherwise, it's a cycle, which is quite interesting when you just look at it from a distance. So that brings us to the book, and the book, if you read it, you'll find that there's bits of all of that in here. There's characters who espouse the values of each of these phases. So there's the dumb guy who really isn't a Satanist at all. He's a Christian who just likes to wear the clothes. Then you've got somebody who's a pagan, and then you've got another one who is actually more of an Anton LaVey Satanist, and then you've got somebody who's really scary and evil. So what Marta has done in here is try and sort of synthesize all of this into one band in one point of time. But there's little Easter eggs in there as well for those that know where to look. And actually some of the reviews I've read have picked up on the Easter eggs, little references that go back to the bands. So I hope you liked the book, this weird little book, and I hope you liked this weird little talk. And I'll take questions. If I can, I'll channel Marta. But thank you for coming. Question.
What was it about the Norwegians for them to go to the extreme like they did?
It's cold. It's really cold up there, isn't it? And boring.
If you can paraphrase the question.
Oh, sorry. So the question was, what about the Norwegians? What is it about the Norwegians that made it so extreme, and why was it them that took it at the place? Interesting question. I don't know. You'd have to ask some sort of sociologist about what was going on in the late 90s or the early 90s in them.
Because a lot of death metal was happening in the US, and they didn't like it because it was very commercial, so they went to extreme version of it, and to shock Christianity what was happening in Norway.
Brilliant. There you go. There's the answer.
It's not about religion. It was about social thing. Yeah. It was trying to shock it.
There you go. Yeah, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of young people angry, doing strange things in Norway at the time. I think that explains some of it, but I don't know. I can't explain why it happened in that particular time. There was loads of it going on. I mean, I mentioned two bands, but there was other stuff going on as well. Goth's a pantomime as well. And actually, interesting question, because we've had this conversation before, I think, about goths, which is I'm not sure what the goth philosophy is. I think goth is just an aesthetic, isn't it? It's not like punks who are nihilists. The goths just like a good, like watching Nosferatu and wearing clothes and dyeing their hair. But I'm happy to be corrected.
Is Marta actually in prison at the moment?
I can't tell you. As a lawyer, I've got obligations of confidence. I couldn't possibly say.
What do you think the future of black metal is?
I think it goes in circles. So this stuff, this kind of which is more meatloaf really than mayhem. I think that it would be nice to sort of bring it back, and music does that, doesn't it? I mean, you had the punks, and then you had grunge, and every now and again you get this sort of movement which says, no, we're going to pare it back and make it less about big production and more about kids doing something in a garage. So I wouldn't be surprised if the next big thing is a band who really pare it back and rather than have the big lush orchestrations, but I don't know. Max. She's Norwegian. I think it's there. It's there. It's there in all the kids. It would be the elder kids at school. It would be in the parents, because Marta's parents are the same age as these guys. I mean, interestingly, so there's one I didn't mention. So there's this band is gruesome, which is really interesting music. It's like really evil elevator music. And it's a one-man band, and the guy behind Burzum was in Mayhem, and he was the bassist who killed the guitarist. He spent most of his life in prison. He's not a very nice man. He's bright, but he's like a lot of the people in the scene. He's a sort of a right-wing lunatic. But one of the reasons, but what I find interesting, and as a huge coincidence, is that he's my age. So these bands which would make, Mayhem were doing this stuff in their teens when I was a teen, and I suspect, to answer Max's question, that it's these guys have now got kids who are your age. So a lot of it, I suppose, for Marta would have come down through parents and uncles and that sort of thing.
I noticed she names the main character after herself. Are there any similarities? Or?
It's written in the first person, so it's a first person account.
Right.
You have to read it to figure.
Well, I was going to fall all the way through and I'm
Okay.
enjoying it.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Ben.
So Adrian said you'd answer any questions. I've got a good legal question. I'm going to forego the free legal advice now. Can you tell us a bit about the process that Marta went through in putting together this book and what iterations it's gone through?
Well, it's there in the book how it came to be. You have to get all the way through to the end before you figure out what it is that you're reading. So I don't think I can tell you anything more than that. But let's have a chat over a glass of wine. Thank you. Shall we have some wine?